Great. So just as people trickle in from lunch, I'm Godfrey. So I'm a haematologist in Cambridge. I do diagnostic work and my clinical practice is MPN. So I'm really grateful to Tom and the organisers just for giving me 10 minutes or so to talk about the UK Rare MyeloProliferative Variant Registry. This is an initiative that's very much a work in progress, but it is something that certainly to date, and I think in the future, the success of this will really depend on support, if we can have it, from the SIG network. So just to set the scene and wake you all up from lunch, I'm just going to do two very brief case stories. So these are two people from RMDTs. First is a 69-year-old lady who presented with a platelet count of 759. She had some cardiovascular risk factors, but no previous vascular events, and was tested for the standard screening for thrombocytosis. Those were negative, normal CRP, normal ferritin, so no clear reason for this. Her marrow is a bit hypercellular for age. She's got a mild increase in megakaryocytes. None of them look particularly convincing in terms of an MPN. And then we did some MyeloNGS. So she's got a DNMT3A nonsense variant, so frameshift variant at about 9%, and then this variant in MYPL, which is a missense variant at about 7%. So this is not highly recurrent. It's been annotated as a variant of uncertain significance. And this is then an acquired non-hotspot variant in one of the MPN drivers. Is it doing anything in this particular patient? Second chap is a bit younger, so he's 31 and presented with some symptoms, so erythromelalgia and aquagenic pruritus, with a platelet count of about 800. Again, no obvious secondary cause, no previous vascular events. He does have splenomegaly, and again, the initial screening studies were all negative. Again, this is a slightly more crushed sample. This is not to teach you histopathology. Cellularity is probably roughly normal for age. Again, a mild increase in megakaryocytes. And there's a few more that are a little bit bigger in this marrow, but again, you wouldn't necessarily put your mortgage on this being an MPN. So on his NGS panel, he's got two SH2B3 variants. The first one is a frameshift variant, so we would expect that to be inactivating at about 49%, which we annotated as pathogenic. And then he's got a second variant, which is missense at around 50%, which is annotated as a variant of uncertain significance. So two potential germline mutations in a putative MPN driver gene. Again, in this patient, are they doing anything? So really, it's on the basis of cases like this that several of us around the UK wanted to put together this registry, which we're calling RAMPHAR. So the aims of the registry are to collect the clinical, histological and laboratory data on UK patients who are being investigated for some kind of myeloproliferative phenotype and are then found to have uncommon variants on their myeloid gene panel. And the aim of this is very much to support current day-to-day practice, so to share these data between UK haematopathology laboratories and genomic laboratories so that we can see, has this variant come up before, how is it called, what did the patient look like, and then support a prospective interpretation of these variants. In terms of the design, one of the reasons I'm here to tell you about this is that it's going to work best if the data is submitted through the SIG network. That's because we are a network. Every hospital should have their samples going through one SIG. And you can imagine that with rare variants, it's really important that we don't have duplicate cases within the database. So it's possible for clinical teams to submit their own data, but it needs to be with communication with your SIG, so we're not getting duplication. Once the cases are submitted, it's currently very simple. It's a line on a spreadsheet. The variant is curated by one of the steering committee scientists. So they just have a look at it and say, if we looked at that today, what would we call it? And that in itself, as you can probably imagine, is already becoming quite an interesting process. But that's our idea of just a quality check before it goes into a more public-facing repository where people may take an interpretation from it. We've then got a read-only copy of the data, which is accessible to those who have a data sharing agreement with us, either a genomic or an SIG lab. And we started this, it's a little over a year ago now. We did an initial pilot phase with just 5 centres, really to make sure that we had a process for submission of the cases and curation of the cases. But hopefully you all received an email from Tom back in November last year to say that we're really happy to open this up to the UK-wide network. Who are we after? So we're really interested in anyone who's been identified for investigation of that myeloproliferative phenotype, so typically erythrocytosis or thrombocytosis, though we do have a few other bits and pieces being submitted, and then one of the following on a gene panel. So either a variant that you think is likely acquired in JAK2, MYPL, SH2B3 or CALR, which is outside the known hotspots. So known hotspots are V617F, exon 12, MYPL 515 and 505, and the standard canonical frameshift variants in CALR. We're particularly interested in cases where there is no canonical MPN driver variant, as you can imagine, because those are cases where we're thinking, is this variant actually causing the phenotype? But we do have some cases submitted where there is actually an MPN canonical driver variant, in addition to something that looks potentially recurrent in another gene, and those can be informative as well. We're also interested in germline variants, so anything that you think is likely to be germline, so variant allele frequency, you can take your pick around about 50% in any of these genes, so that we can start looking at some of those rarer variants. Really things that you think of, there's obviously a lot of potential germline variants out there, so it needs someone to have a look at them, think this is potentially relevant to the phenotype, and generally those are going to be things that are low frequency in the population databases. We have not defined what counts as low frequency before somebody asks that question. We're also quite interested in cases where we haven't got a canonical MPN phenotypic driver mutation, but there's an acquired variant in another gene. So we do sometimes find cases where there's, for example, a clear thrombocytosis, but all we have is a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in a different myeloid gene, without anything in one of the MPN genes. And obviously that needs to be in the absence of a different confirmed myeloid disorder like CMML. So in the recent BSH guidance on investigation of triple negative thrombocytosis, we've called these patients clonal thrombocytosis of undetermined significance, and we're quite keen to see what happens to these patients if they have complications, for example. So just to run you through the approvals process, it should be straightforward. Each centre just needs a standard data sharing agreement with the lead site, which is Cambridge. That really is just a signature on a Caldecott Guardian letter. And then it also just needs to be registered locally as a service development audit type project. So far, we've got 9 centres who have those data sharing agreements in place, including the original 5. And then we've had some interest since November time from another 5 additional centres as well as one in the Republic of Ireland who's keen to join. Mostly these are coming from the HMDSs, which I think is a clear way to make it work, but there are also some very invested clinical teams who, if we can kind of work with their HMDSs, we're also keen to support that. I think the one thing we've learned along the way is that getting these approvals through is very variable in terms of how difficult it is. I think that's a challenge across these kind of UK real-world evidence projects in general. I think the quickest centre took less than 2 weeks to get their approval through. One of the original pilot centres still hasn't got theirs approval through after over a year. So it's very, very variable. Things that help in terms of getting things through the information governance process are to highlight that this is for sharing of fully anonymised data. You do have to have a key so that you know who the patient was, but in terms of what gets submitted to us, it's fully anonymised data. And the aim for the moment is for support with routine patient care. So that's the primary aim of the registry. I didn't feel I could turn up with no data because we have been collecting data for a little while, so just a quick look at what's there so far. We've got 121 cases submitted from 7 centres so far. Most of them are patients who are being submitted where there's no canonical MPN driver, and they're mostly presenting with thrombocytosis or less often erythrocytosis. And then we've got a smaller group where there is an MPN phenotype and they have got that MPN driver, but they've got an additional variant that's thought to be of interest. In terms of acquired and germline variants, the majority are being submitted by their centre as a putative acquired non-hotspot variant in one of those genes, with a smaller proportion being a suspected germline gene. I think one of the challenges in this field is really how we define those 2 categories and what that means when we come to annotate them. So, for example, just having a quick look at the data, if we look at those 81 cases where the centre has said we think this is an acquired variant in a gene, actually 16 of those cases have a VAF that could certainly be germline. And one of the things we'll probably do as a study along the way is see how some of these variants are being called and how they would be called if they were in a somatic or a germline setting, because as you know, that can be quite different. In terms of the genes involved, thinking about the cases where we haven't got a canonical MPN driver, MYPL is the top one, then JAK2, SH2B3 and a handful of others. And similarly for those who have a canonical MPN driver, again, MYPL is the top one, closely followed by JAK2 and a few more SH2B3s. I think for me, just kind of where we're going to head to in terms of the lowest hanging fruit, for example, just looking at MYPL acquired variants, I think this is a group where there are quite a few variants that are being called a VUS, but with a little bit more evidence, we can show that they're recurrent and call them differently. So in the database so far, we've got 48 cases of MYPL variants that were called acquired. 38 of those are definitely acquired in terms of their variant allele frequency, really would be very unlikely to be germline. And that includes a collection of cases that are recurrent at serine 204, So those cases all presented with a thrombocytosis and no canonical MPN driver, so clearly those are able to cause the phenotype independently. Luke in the room is actually doing a study looking at those to try and get a cohort across the UK and better describe that phenotype, so talk to him if you've got cases. We've then got, for example, in MIPL, there's then tyrosine 591. This is also a recurrent variant, but almost all of the cases in the database are being found where a patient has an MPN and that and is found in the context of an additional MPN driver, often at disease progression. So clearly these different variants are doing different things in different clinical circumstances. Interestingly, we've got one just next door at residue 592. Looks like it's acquired, being called a VUS. Again, interested as to whether we can get recurrence on some of those variants and call them differently. And I think there's probably a little cluster of variants around 498, 499, which again, I hope that if we get some more in the database, that we can start to convert those into likely pathogenic variants in our reports. So in terms of next steps, this is really very much the data collection phase. We're really keen to hear from people who'd be happy to help with submitting some cases. The next steps, I hope, will be to identify some of these recurrent acquired variants. They're probably the easiest ones to pick up, meaning that we can annotate them more confidently. And then, ideally, if we've got a little cohort, describe that phenotype, confirm that those are pathogenic and can be described as such, put that in the protocol, and then no one has to worry about that when they're making these decisions in clinical practice. So turn those VUSs into pathogenic variants. And then the slightly harder thing is probably looking at the germline variants. So they're obviously really, really of interest, identifying some candidates, and it may be that we need some more detailed work on some of those, for example, using projects such as UK Biobank to see if we can pick out some of those candidate variants and try and work out better what they're doing. And it may be that we need some research approvals to look in more detail at some of those. So please join us. The HemeStar network of registrars, resident doctors, have offered their help in finding people to support with data curation. This can be quite a big set of patients, particularly if you've been doing NGS in your laboratories for a long time. So they're very happy to help. And I will just finish by thanking the people who have supported this to date. Several of them are in the room. Couldn't do this without doing it as a network. This is how you get in contact with us. So we have our own email address. We now have a website, or just chat to me over coffee. And also a big thank you to the BSH who are giving us some funding from a genomics grant to support the work going forward. Thank you.
We have got a couple of minutes for questions if anyone's got anything. So just Ulrika down there.
Hi, thank you so much. Just a simple question. Presumably there's international networks looking at this as well. I'm sorry, I don't know already.
There's an ELN project looking, I think, at something similar. The thing that always we find a challenge is the data sharing agreements, which is why we've decided to start small and grow this from the UK. I haven't had a conversation with the ELN about their projects, but it may be that once we have a decent body of data, that, as I say, if we can then get a formal approval to use the database as a research source, that we might then have a mandate on which to share that more widely. But we thought we'd start small and grow, but you're right, there are, ideally you'd do this on an international level.
This is a numbers game, isn't it? But yeah, sounds. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, please do participate. Do you want to introduce yourself first of all?
Good afternoon. So we're like the second session after lunch. Hopefully we can keep you entertained. I'm Liron. I'm a hematopathologist and molecular pathologist. I was trained in the US where there is a single sort of track for hematology diagnostics. Pathology is sort of a laboratory medicine specialty, and most people follow on with fellowships, including hematopathology and molecular pathology. Most hematopathologists signing out will be able to analyze any test that is presented to them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that model. Tom.
Thank you, and I think you know me. So what we're going to do is summarize what we've been doing. Essentially, a combination of a survey and a workshop, and then we're going to move on to what we found from the surveys and workshop and what the next steps are and how you can help. So first of all, we worked together with the BLPG, BSH Lab SIG to generate a medical workforce survey. Now we also wanted to, and we planned to do a scientific workforce sort of equivalent essentially, but we haven't done that yet, and that's something to plan for this year. So this was sent out to all the HMDS leads in the country and essentially asking a series of questions, and we know people have got survey fatigue about medical workforce, the sort of opportunities, challenges, also trying to get a picture. And of the 25 labs, we had 13 responses. We didn't give a huge amount of time for that. That's not bad for a survey, as you know. One of the questions we might ask later on is whether we do want to repeat that, given survey fatigue, to give people an idea of where we're at, they can benchmark themselves. But also we need to think about how we sort of follow through on the scientific workshop and equivalence as well. So the first question we asked was, what is haematopathology? Which is means different things to different people. And this alludes to what I was talking about earlier about people speaking different languages. So we had 13 different responses, all very different. Some of them were very much focused on professional background, a minority, just about 3 people suggesting, well, it's a histopathologist who does haematopathology, whereas others are a more broad-based approach. Other people focusing on what kind of sample they're involved in analysing, or it's about diagnosing blood cancers. So we took those specific survey responses to our workshop, and in the workshop itself, we had 18 participants. That included not just BLPG and BSH Lab SIG members, but also HMDS leads, and also explicitly TPDs. We reached out to the BSH Education Committee to make sure we had people interested in education there as well. And in that group, we discussed the responses. We discussed the American definition, which is, make haematopathology great again. As often, not to put a negative slant on it, forgive me, but was very good and very comprehensive. And what many of you might not know is that Liron has been working on this for several years. She's reached out and worked within the BLPG. She also worked with the BSH Lab SIG a couple of years ago to draft a fellowship curriculum, partly based on being inspired by what's happening in the US and her own training background, which is unusual for the UK, but also to get feedback from different places. So we actually have a draft fellowship curriculum and definition, and we used that as well to see what people thought. And actually we got people to vote on it in the meeting, and most people agreed that both the American definition and Liron's drafted definition that the BLPG and BSH had endorsed covered all the bases, was both broad enough and narrow enough to make sure it supported things. A few people were a bit worried that it was so broad it maybe neglected histopathologists and the workforce crisis that they're facing. We'll talk about later on, but broadly speaking, there's quite a lot of consensus. And there's also consensus that it's useful to have a consensus at all, because unless you have a definition, you're not sure what the problem you're trying to solve. So this is our working definition of what haematopathology is, which has been endorsed by various bodies and via this method. So then moving on to some of the survey and workforce practices. So this is a busy slide. The participants in the workshop, we talked about a lot. We spent 2 hours going over in more detail of the survey. So they've got a more detailed pack, but you'll get this later on. Essentially, what I want to sort of point out is everywhere's a bit different. We asked both about the whole-time equivalent consultants in each lab, but also the head count. And we then ranked them according to how many whole-time equivalents. So on the right-hand side, these are all anonymized, so I don't know where they've come from, but you've got HMDS number 3 with essentially, it looks like 7 whole-time equivalents, so 70 PAs, if you like, of consultant time. But the head count for that lab was 12, whereas you've got HMDS lab number 2, which actually has 17 different consultants, but they actually proportionately spend less time, all the way down to HMDS lab number 5, which had 11 consultants in it, but actually the whole-time equivalent is only 3. So it just goes to show that there's really variable amounts of time that people spend on HMDS activities, despite the fact that the headcount is different. So that just goes to show the variation we have across the UK in the labs that responded, at least. And then on the other side, you've got the mix by profession. So in the green, you've got people from a histopathology professional background. In the red, you've got people from, I think, I'm trying to read my own writing, haematology, and then healthcare scientists in blue. Yeah. So it just goes to show that not everywhere have healthcare scientists at consultant level involved. And on the top is just a different way of summarising the same data, the range, the median, in the different groups. It just goes to show that actually people have very different consultant models, mainly based on how much time people spend doing HMDS activities in amongst everything else. And that's interesting in itself. We also asked questions about trying to match that to the size of the population. Again, some people didn't respond to this, but it's not necessarily the large populations automatically have the largest number of consultant whole-time equivalents, and then when you divide it. So there's no right answer to this, but once you start asking the questions, we might think about how this works as well. And then starting to ask questions, do we have a workforce problem? How many retirements do you anticipate? And again, that varies according to different laboratories, but it just gives you a sense of what people are looking ahead to how many of their consultants are retiring as well. We then asked a series of sort of free text questions in the survey, and sort of in the workshop discussed a lot of these. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm just going to leave them up here for a minute or so for you to read them. They'll all be shared with you afterwards, just to give the kind of idea of what people are focusing on. And again, the next slide, saying similar things, highlighted the common themes. And again, challenges, and some things about structured training, particularly coming through. So these are the things we were discussing, reading, and later on coming to what we're going to do about it. We also asked about the good things. What are the strengths about the collaboration, the multi-professional working, and there are a lot of really good things about the current UK training models. It's often easy to focus on the negatives, but again, here's some of the positives that we focus on, because we are really good at this. You are all amazing people who look after our patients, and you are leading us into the future, pioneering precision medicine. So it's just to be clear that we think this is a good thing, but as I said earlier, hyper-specialisation. Every time you solve a problem, you create a new one. And this is where our strength is our weakness. Essentially, we are really pioneering, really super specialised, and that's great, and it's often very attractive to people, but when people retire, the people behind us, are we training them well enough to replace us? And we are not sure how to train people, both scientific and medical, and centralisation into an HMDS, that is good for many reasons, but it also de-skills the people using our services, the clinical sort of people who have to identify whether a sample gets sent to us in the first place, and there's a real tension there between centralisation versus local and flexible things, and not everywhere in the country works the same way. Sort of East London, where I work, is different from the Highlands of Scotland or in Cornwall and places like that. So you can't necessarily have one size fits all for your local population. And there's some concerns about whether histopathology has a greater problem than haematology, because there are fewer people choosing to specialise in haematopathology potentially. And many of you, particularly from a histopathology background, know about the workforce crisis there is in paediatric and perinatal pathology, which is a massive problem. And we don't want to sleepwalk into those kind of problems as well. So we need to think about this as well. We asked people how they trained. Most people, of course, train on the job. That's inevitably how it works. It was quite interesting that many people have actually undertaken fellowships as well, either post-CCT or pre-CCT, and some people abroad as well. And that's quite interesting, because we're going to talk about some of those as potential solutions. Most people said that resident doctors, so registrars, rotate through their HMDS, and of course, if you don't identify people at that stage, get them interested, they're never going to want to become consultants as well. We also asked about who's reporting the various samples. We've asked various questions about flow and genomics as well, but I won't cover that at the moment. We're talking about, so essentially on the left-hand side, the aspirates, most centres have just haematologists reporting that, but some places you've got people from a histopathology and a haematology background. And a slightly separate question, because we focus on medics first of all, we have got 5 out of the 13 respondents had healthcare scientists reporting their aspirates. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you've got more of a mix. There are a number of places where it's histopathologists who focus on the triphynes, but you've also got several places where haematologists and histopathologists are reporting it, and one place where you've got a healthcare scientist reporting triphynes as well. So it's an interesting, because around the country, because we only see our own practice, we're used to our own practice, but it's interesting to see how other people are doing things. And I think I'm going to hand over to Liron here.
Thank you. So if we think that the US has a solution that might fit here, can we just plug it in? Well, no. It did appear from the workshop and from previous engagements that there is interest in training in the HMDS setting for diagnostic hematopathology, but only few offer fellowships. What are the issues that we are facing? Well, firstly, staffing. Second, standardization. There's lack of funding, lack of regulatory body support. There are physical and geographical boundaries with only partial availability of expertise and testing repertoire. So, for example, centralization of genomics, as we all know. And for residents, there's lack of interest, lack of confidence, and lack of experience. And this stems from little or no representation on exams, limited exposure to diagnostics and teaching during their primary training. There is a need for uninterrupted training time, which currently doesn't exist, neither in in pathology or in hematology. And other surveys have shown interest in hematopathology, but variable confidence and exposure. So during this workshop that we had, we discussed the barriers and the solutions. We discussed the existing UK histopathology, hematology, and subspecialization pathways. There is a limited flexibility due to GMC requirements, with capabilities in practice being high-level professional competencies, curricula difficult to change, and requiring agreement from multiple stakeholders. There is some potential flexibility within existing framework for subspecialization, stage D within histopathology, which is the post-FRC Path 2 exam period, and pediatric hematology also has this sort of framework. But funding is not easily available for post-CCT fellowships or OOPS. And we know that the US incorporates hematology diagnostics and hematopathology early in resident training and has numerous dedicated fellowships in hematopathology and genetics with board certification under the oversight of the ACGME that oversees all training programs in the US, sorry. And there is a draft curriculum with a syllabus rotation competencies for a fellowship that has been discussed with the BSH and BLPG, and I'll present it in a moment. There are a few local fellowships already in place, and we need a similar discussion on hematopathology scientific training, just to put it out there, and workforce to align with any proposals. So why do we want standardization, certification, and competency? Well, uniform training is important to create expertise and define standards and competencies. Expertise ensures that we meet high quality of standard of care. We want to recognize successful fellows or consultants as subspecialists. In a CCT in histopathology or hematology alone, sorry, is it sufficient to become a hematopathologist? I don't think so at this time. And UCAS accreditation depends on competency. I don't know, Tom, if you want to chip in here regarding UCAS.
So I'm a laboratory director, so when UCAS come along, they're very keen, increasingly so, to make sure we demonstrate competency for specific tasks, such as reporting bone marrow aspirate, reporting flow cytometry, etc., and also demonstrating ongoing competency to do so. So they're increasingly focused on that. At the same time, UCAS don't understand what an SIHMDS is generally, unless you're lucky enough to get an assessor who does that. So we need to support each other and support UCAS in how all of that works.
And it's clear that all of this is tied to hematopathology consultant workforce planning and CPD. It's also clear there's no single, simple, correct solution, so we can't just take the US formula and plug it into the UK. Curricular and training programs are rigid, although we can create some flexibility. There is a desire for harmonization and standardization, but also flexibility and recognition of local needs. It needs to work within existing training pathway and curricula in a short, medium term, with the long term maybe being creating an actual subspecialty. Specialized in high quality, but not narrow or unattractive. It needs to look at the whole training pathway, not just specialty trainees, but also consultants and workforce needs. So our solution needs to be broad enough to incorporate all that. Histopathology, hematology, and scientific workforce and training have different needs. Blurring professional boundaries can help with some workforce issues, but also causes others. We talked about pre- and post-CCT fellowships being options. Local providers want independent consultants to authorize reports and not trainees. It needs engagement with key stakeholders in a working group, and formal routes and fellowships plus and training, sorry, I'm not sure, training and education networks and events. What can we do in the UK? We can standardize through a minimum requirement using SIPs, for example, structured fellowships or rotations such as SPIN, which I don't think we're going to discuss today in detail, but we'll talk about the next steps. So SPIN is a pediatric hematology sort of rotation that is existing currently and may be applicable also for this hematopathology rotation. Early exposure and SPR training is needed both in hematology and in histopathology. We need to incorporate it into the SPR curriculum, and we need to think about workforce planning. So what about hematopathology fellowships? We discussed those. They can be pre or post CCT. Currently, they are locally coordinated, but we need to discuss a national coordinated fellowship. So there is a draft curriculum that I sort of put together, again, largely based on the US curriculum, but with adjustments to UK programs and with feedback from various stakeholders. And we need to talk about that and how to assess competency. So this is just a snapshot from the syllabus of this fellowship with the diagnostic competency goals being the ability to analyze any laboratory result that is associated with hematology diagnostics, particularly malignant but benign as well, and interpretation of bone marrow specimens, including aspirates, antrophines, lymph nodes, and other tissue, and any advanced diagnostic technique as it becomes available. And this is the suggested rotation schedule, which is mostly heavy on bone marrow and lymph node rotations, but also incorporates the different labs. And this is just another snapshot from the schedule for our fellow that is going to start in March. We have an inaugural fellowship starting next month. So you can see this individual is from a histopathology background. Therefore, the 3 weeks, for example, are just concentrated on blood. And I guess if someone came from hematology, you could structure it differently, where they'd have a beginning of introduction to histology, but all the rest is pretty much mostly bone marrow and lymph node rotations, along with rotations in the labs. And if you look on the right side, you can see, or hopefully you can see the molecular rotation, where the idea is that you start with shadowing testing, and then shadowing analysis, and then eventually being incorporated into the analysis procedure. And there is also a week that is dedicated to integrated reporting. This is an example of the flow cytometry rotation. So you can see sort of the concepts that should be covered, and then the schedule, which again starts with introductory lectures and laboratory work, and then shadowing live case analysis, and then trying out analysis by themselves and having assessment at the end. So in the recent years, I've approached several regulatory bodies with a lot of help from individuals who are here in this room and some that aren't. But I did encounter a lot of resistance. So within the Royal College, it appears that there is reluctance to increase training time, recognize subspecialization, support training, or fund such fellowships. The BSH, I did approach to try and get funding for a fellowship or a grant, and was declined. The Hematology SAC, I did approach them, and we discussed that a change of curriculum might be extremely difficult to do, but SIPs or rotations are easier and generate, and we should generate a working group to this end. And then I have the one body that hasn't been contacted yet is the GMC, which hopefully we will do eventually, but again, this is in the longer term. And then back to Tom.
So pointing out the fact that when you delve into this more, you realise the GMC are quite rigid for good reasons, as well as bad, but also 2 Royal Colleges, at least for haematology, you have to be involved in SAC. So it's actually very hard to change the curriculum. So I think what you have to do is acknowledge we have to work within the current rigid framework and use the flexibility we have. Think about changing it in the future and inputting to future curricula, but don't try and kick the world, break your foot, I think. We also talked a little bit about, well, we can talk about structured training programs, but we can also talk about how we share good practice already. We are already doing loads of teaching. We can put that together, advertise existing courses, put together existing resources, try and take some of these kind of formative aspects and learn together. And today wasn't really focused on education so much, but we can help coordinate other meetings that might be, and networking, other events and things like that. We also need to focus at all stages of the pathway, not just for people in training, people coming up to it, persuade them to become haematology or histopathology registrars in the first place, but also we really need to serve the needs of consultants and their ongoing CPD as well, because that's the workforce we're actively trying to create at the end of it. And we need to support each other. There's also educational aspects of EQA. The next talk will focus on that, but there are really important, helpful aspects. So it's again linking back to the other parts of what we're talking about. But we do want to focus on haematopathology fellowship options and things like that. So we want to almost create something, we'll call it the Haematopathology Academy, willing volunteers to come together to take this forward. Now this is a very busy slide, but we agreed in the workshop what we wanted to do is drop an options table, because what's clear is there's no simple answer to this complex question. What we need to do is we need to go into schools and persuade them to go to medical school or do biomedical science degrees. We're not going to focus on that much at the moment, but we also need to focus on medical trainees at earlier stages before they become registrars, etc., etc. So we are going to focus on those aspects a little bit, but what we really need to focus on are the stages of training for histopathologists and haematologists about how we support them to become, when they grow up, haematopathologists. And we also need to focus on how we keep those haematopathology consultants, how we sustain them from their first consultant day up until their retirement as well. So we need to have a multi-pronged approach to things. So one of these options is a post-CCT fellowship. It's the one that's often talked about, and it's one of the ones which we thought was the most viable, but that in itself is a funding problem. So we need to work together to how we solve that funding problem, because we also need to produce something, address this nationally to make sure we don't sleepwalk into a national workforce crisis, but we all need to make sure we adapt that locally. So rather than just focusing on big teaching hospitals, say in London, we need to train people where we need haematopathology consultants to work, and that's not always in the same place at the specialist HMDS labs and training centres. So we need to balance those different needs at the same time. So the idea is that with comments and endorsement from you guys, some of you were in that workshop as well, so anything we've missed, we'd be keen to hear. We need to take this forward into some concrete steps to how we support each other and how we support our future haematopathologists. So question for anyone who happened to be in the workshop, is there anything important that we think that Liron and I have missed? And question to everyone in the room, do you endorse this approach? And is there any appetite for another survey? Or should we wait for a kind of parallel scientific workforce project to sort of go on? Because I'm really keen to get this summarised as soon as possible so we can actually move on with some concrete proposals. And please, if you're volunteering, contact us. Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes for comments and questions. Right, good. So Peter at the back, and then Andrew, sort of.
Thank you. I'll put my college hat on. I'm responsible for workforce and the honorary officers in the college just now. So I think this is very timely. And I really would just like to say that I think as a college, we would be very grateful to see any interest in this sort of development. I think the impression that the college is standing in the way, from my point of view, I'm sorry if I picked it up wrong, but I would like to think the college is not an obstacle to this. There is a difficulty in that the curricula, we own the curricula for the medical, or for most of the medical specialties, but the difficulty is the regulatory body is the GMC. The college has no regulatory authority. And you try getting an extension of a program through the GMC, because we tried that with histopath because of the amount of molecular pathology that needs to go in there now. And we were very firmly told, go back in your box. It has to fit in 5 years. You're getting no more time for it. And we said, well, but the reality is that it's taking nearly 6 years already. And they said, not hearing. So the difficulty we have is that, whilst trying to keep curricula up to date with what practice requires of them, we're facing the obstacle of the regulator who says you've got to do more in less time. But where have we heard that before in laboratory medicine, I may ask? The other piece to this, which I think is important, is that if we look at scientists, I know we haven't looked at scientists today, but if we just look forward to scientists, half the problem that we have there is that the curricula are owned by the National School of Clinical Science, and the difficulty with that is that there's no money to upgrade or to bring up to date those particular curricula. And so the exams, which are necessarily tied to the curricula, which the college does set, but the college sets exams because it's required to set them to the curricula, not to the practice. And so we find there's a disharmony between what people are being asked in their exams and in what they actually do. And so we're having difficulty, and I gather that the HSST exam or the STP exam in molecular pathology attracted a pass rate of 0% in its recent run, which is a disgrace, frankly, which we cannot control because the funding that is necessary to upgrade those curricula has to come from NHS England. So there is a huge, you've identified a huge area of a need for work. But I think in terms of the development of something useful, which as a college we could endorse, along with BSH, for example, is something that I would personally, with my workforce role in the college, be very happy to be engaged with as soon as and whenever. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So Andrew, and then got Alan here.
Yeah, a lot of this training happens on the job, especially post-CCT. When you start introducing words like fellowship, it seems like an extra thing which needs more money, but a lot of on-the-job training actually does work. And what about just making that a little bit more structured? So you CCT in haematology or histopathology, you become a consultant, and then, but with a view to specialising in haematopathology, and you sort of learn on the job with your colleagues, but have a bit more structure around that. Is that something that might be a little bit easier to introduce rather than having something more formal?
Yes, absolutely. I can't move back to the previous slide, but showing the table, but and it was too small for you to read. But we're very much focused on that stage as well. We need to structure existing training and support people to do exactly what you described. And I think, and what Peter described quite eloquently, is we're working in a very rigid framework, and I don't think we should gradually, slowly try and change that framework, but I think we need to work in the existing framework and do exactly what you've described. Fellowships aren't for everyone or everywhere, but I think they're one of the potential solutions. I think we should explore them, but I totally agree. We need to do what we're already doing well and make sure we do it as well as we can. I don't know if you've got any comments on that.
It's just that currently the primary training is not sufficient, so I don't think you can expect to be competent by the end of your training to even start a job in hematopathology, for example, if you've not dedicated time for it. And some people are lucky and they get to do these rotations, but it's not for everyone. And I think, yeah, that it's a problem.
Okay, just maybe one more question from, or maybe two. Okay, very briefly, Alan.
All I was going to say is, so the workforce survey that was mentioned from the ICCS, it's working now, we did include, in fact, it was virtually all hematopathologists that were on that publication with me. And even in the US, it seems that the practice varies hugely. So some will sit and gate, some get analysed files handed to them and they look at it and go, yep, we're happy. And just something, again, in the flow talk was one of the biggest problems was lack of career progression, and you're seeing there's a lack of people. So I think pulling this together with the scientific workforce could be a really good way of trying to develop consultant scientists, which people aren't using, to hopefully plug a gap in the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely, and we need to work together, and that's a bit about the blurring the boundaries to make sure that's done well. And then just the last quick question.
Just more of a comment, and I would like to advocate for some caution around learning on the job, particularly if you're trying to accomplish that in an HMDS setting. As a histopathologist working in an SI-HMDS that is not within or linked too closely with the histopathology department, I do not think you could learn histopathology component on the job here.
Okay, thank you. There's a challenge for us. All right, well, thank you very much. And our next speakers come up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lakshmi Venkatraman, currently at Nottingham. And on behalf of the BLPG Council, I would just like to put forward the view of the so-called lymphoma pathologists. This is a learned society that was established in 1974 by a group of histopathologists with the aim of fostering learning in diagnosis, classification, and research on lymphomas. The BLPG continues to have this aim to this day, and we organize at least 2 scientific meetings a year and also hold the hematopathology EQA. The meetings usually have well-renowned speakers and provide good scientific and practical updates. We have a long history of seminal contributions to lymphoma and other pathology from people who are in these photographs that you can recognize. Some of them are present day, like Ming, and there's others in the small vignettes. We liaise with national and international bodies, including Royal College, the American Society of Hematopathology, as well as the European Society of Hematopathology. Huge innovations in immunohistochemistry by David Mason, etc., are not listed in this photograph. We continue to contribute to the WHO and ICC classifications and their updates. We've even got books written on bone marrow hematopathology. So as part of DNA, we have to work, in order to continue our daily work, the laboratory workflow, etc., we need to work with hematologists. Our perspectives are slightly different. As pathologists, we are focused on disease diagnosis, classification, as well as mechanisms, and we use those sort of tools to think about them. The hematologists, they are focused on, obviously, the patient treatment and therefore recruitment into patient trials, targeted therapies, and even risk groupings so that you can decide who gets to have bone marrow transplant and who gets when ASA, for instance. Our roots are definitely with the cellular pathology. We share a histopathology and immunohistochemistry laboratory, and therefore concerns around specimen adequacy, the common limbs systems that we use to report are all shared between us. There are serious borders between inflammation and neoplasia that requires us to collaborate quite closely with histopathologists. And we are well used to this, to working our way through contradictions between results from different diagnostic modalities and also resolving differences of opinion between pathologists through consensus. Our challenges are quite a few, and a lot has been listed. The upcoming ones are definitely molecular classifications in the world of lymphomas as well as the myeloid that's already happened. To get these classifications going and more genomic testing, it has to be done to scale, and a degree of centralization is required, which sort of means you need to focus on the absolute basic, which is specimen transport, which is not easy to achieve. Workforce training, a lot has already been said by Liron and Tom, and so will not elaborate. But it's quite a thought that if you're on a scientist income living in Cambridge, how do you find a house? And then the IT systems, much has been spoken about. Those of us dealing with digital pathology, we know how difficult it has been to integrate the digital pathology with the LIMS, as well as the electronic patient record. AI is just a train coming, and we've already seen the Heme IO today, which would almost eliminate the need for MDTs. But in terms of pathology, it will change the way we work. A lot of the basics will be done by AI, but the people who are left to do the actual supervision of the so-called AI would have to be well trained in basics. So if you're going to get your literature from AI, how are you going to verify the data? So it's a good time to take stock. We did another survey, and not surprisingly, the survey was sent to the BLPG EQA participants, and about 20% of them responded. Most of them are histopathologists, either based in SIHMDSs or networked HMDSs. About 30% are not based in any HMDS. And 37% of them do things other than hematopathology, including very challenging specialties like renal and autopsy. The work setting also included access to genomics, but most histopathologists integrate genomic information rather than report genomic information. Very few are participating in active research. Those that do indulge in really interesting things like AI and healthcare sustainability. So we asked two open-ended questions among many, and one of them was, what works well? And the answers were predictably skewed towards in my center. So it was basically availability of tools, a degree of standardization brought about by a structure like HMDS or SIHMDS, and having a single quality management system. In short, everything that could be done locally or regionally was what people felt to be working well. And there was a feeling that liquid samples are better catered for than solid samples, which don't have a recognized pathway. And the flip side of it, which is what could be improved, I'd like to think it's a different 21 out of 40 that answered that one. Everybody talked about access, difficulty in accessing genomics within or outside the region, the long turnaround times, the issues around accountability and governance when samples are sent across regions. And there were clearly expressed needs like increase in staffing, IT systems in NHS that could actually talk to one another, cross-disciplinary training. And there were also some wishes like how do we modify test directory and better integration. And again, the issue of having a pathway for solid samples was quite strong. Everybody agreed integrated report is the way to go. And the first two statements just reflects that sentiment. Clearly, people didn't like the idea of long, incomprehensible reports. People felt it should be clinically meaningful. It should be incorporating all relevant information, preferably created by a pathologist, should be in a clinically meaningful framework, and there should be no standalone reports. So in conclusion, I'd like to say most hematopathologists, they are members of the BLPG. They work in a variety of practice settings, though majority work in a single integrated or a networked HMDS. A significant minority do not. And while a lot of people have access to genomics, there are serious concerns around turnaround time, loss of skills, and remoteness of the GLH from the HMDS in which people work. There is some mitigation suggested, as I just said in a slide ago, which was cross-disciplinary training and best practice standards. But and some other small suggestions like modifying the test directory, modernizing, and more integration. So I'd like to stop here, and specific thanks to Thomas for helping us. And we'll take any questions you may have after the presentation on EQA by Anna. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So this is a slight shift. The other component of the BLPG that we're going to talk about is the EQA that is run from the BLPG. So unlike... Is this working? Okay. Unlike some of the EQA schemes we've heard about today, the BLPG runs an interpretive EQA scheme, which is what is run across all of cellular pathology for all subspecialties. And these form a very important part of appraisal, and there's some degree of identifying people who are not perhaps performing to the standard expected, although these are not comparable to exam schemes. And I'm going to go through how this EQA scheme runs. I think we all know what the benefits of the EQA schemes are. This is taken from the college document on the EQA schemes, but I think they're really important. We've talked a bit about maintaining standards, harmonizing diagnoses, but also some cellular pathologists are still working in relative isolation, so making sure that everybody is working to the same standards, the same nomenclature, and potentially identifying those who may need some extra CPD or support. The CellPath NQAAP has always played a very important role in the EQA and the interpretive EQA schemes. And in the past, they have played a role in supporting that identifier and in identifying people who are not performing to the standard expected. Although when I was looking this up on the college recently, I noted that they had actually paused their activities from January. And this becomes relevant when I talk a bit about the BLPG EQA. So what is the BLPG Haempath EQA? This is run by 3 of us as a subcommittee of the BLPG Council. We run this twice a year. We have about up to 140 participants who are doing the lymphoid component. We also have a bone marrow component, which has a slightly smaller participation rate. And for every round of this EQA, we have 8 cases, 6 of which are lymphoid. Normally, we try to include two non-neoplastic cases because that reflects the reality of the sort of cellular pathology component of Haempath, and 2 bone marrows. We use a platform on the Leeds virtual pathology website to run the EQA from. At present, our EQA scheme is not registered with the college, so most interpretive EQA schemes are registered with the college, as is not for kind of historic reasons. We've been in the process of trying to register it, although obviously at the moment that process is suspended. So how does it work in practice? Each round, there's a nominated HMDS centre or even a non-HMDS centre reporting HemePath, which collates eight cases, and they submit them with clinical information, any relevant immunophenotyping, molecular. The subcommittee reviews them, checks that we've got sufficient information, checks the quality of the slides. They're sent to Leeds for scanning. We open the EQA for about 6 weeks, during which time participants can submit their answers. We collate all of the responses, we review the responses given, and we give provisional scores. So we score it as if someone's given a diagnosis that we believe to be correct, and these diagnoses have to be given according to WHO and ICC. They're scored 2. If they've given a diagnosis which is not necessarily dangerous but is not correct, we would give them 1. That's an area of quite a lot of debate. And then if it's completely wrong, we give them a score 0. We then have a meeting of EQA participants run by the BLPG where we discuss all of the cases and we issue certificates for appraisal, revalidation, etc. Many of these interpretive EQA schemes would then send letters out to those who are considered poor performers based on low scores over a number of schemes. We're not doing that at present, and that's something perhaps to be discussed in the future. So this is what the platform looks like. You're given a very brief history. So this is one of our cases, 25-year-old female with a large nasal mass. You can then look at the slides. You're given some additional information because we don't scan every single slide. And if relevant, we will give any molecular information that's needed to make the final diagnosis. So all this, you can look at all of the scanned images. And then we collate all the scores. So as a committee, we will kind of provisionally score, for example, in this one, anyone who'd called it an extranodal NK T-cell lymphoma, we would propose that they should be scored 2. And then we got some responses that were a little bit more variable, like NK T-cell lymphoma, NK T-cell lymphoma nasal type, and then some people who hadn't answered. We take this to the meeting and we discuss it as a group, and the method is consensus scoring. So this is what makes it slightly different to the NICRAS EQAs, that the consensus of the group of expertise there decide which diagnoses we would accept as score 2 and which ones we would not accept. And essentially, that's how it ends. You get a certificate of participation. What we would hope is then people who are not scoring as well would go back, reflect on this, include this in their appraisal process. So as part of the survey, we asked people about what their experience was of the EQA. I think we've already looked at that, and I think what's clear is that a lot of the people participating in the EQA are not just doing HemePath, so they will also be doing EQAs for all of their other relevant specialties. I'm not going to go through this because I think we've covered this already. Unsurprisingly, because people are coming from a cellular pathology background, there's a higher proportion of people who do just the lymphoid component, and there's always a proportion of people who will not be doing the bone marrows because it's not part of their job plan. We don't have anybody at the moment participating who just does bone marrows because at the moment the participants are only people coming from a cellular pathology background. You can see that most people are participating in this because it forms part of their appraisal and CPD. Some people said other reasons, but didn't particularly specify, so I don't know why. I'm not sure why they're participating. But the general comments are that this is a good educational process, and I think people find it interesting, but I think the general theme is people find it educational. And then we asked whether people would like to change anything about the EQA, and you can see there's a complete split, and I think this probably reflects the fact that the participants are doing very, very different jobs. So the majority, well, almost 50% said, actually, no, let's just carry on as we are. But over 30% actually said, yes, we should change it, and this needs to reflect more about more of HMDS practice, which is obviously very relevant to today. I'm not going to go through all of these comments, but I've kind of grouped them into themes. There was a general theme in the comments about this should just be for education, stop trying to market, let's just discuss the cases and learn from it. The middle section in orange is about a problem with the platform, which we know about, so I don't think we need to comment on that. And then there's some comments at the end about how do we tailor the EQA scheme to reflect different people's practice. So we've got a range from people doing full integrated reporting and looking at all components of the integrated report to people who are only looking at tissue samples for lymphoid pathology. And we've got a bit of a split in what do we think the EQA should have. But I think the big thing that comes out of this is that half the participants said that we should split bone marrows and lymphoid and have a completely separate EQA for bone marrows. And this just reflects the same thing, that there's a significant voice now saying, can we have a separate EQA to reflect bone marrows? Because if you're doing a lot of bone marrow practice, the EQA only has 2 bone marrows in it. And then, should this EQA be for education? Should it be for assessing performance? A bit of both. Most people are saying it's a bit of both, but obviously we have to acknowledge that in terms of assessing performance, it's only a very small snapshot, currently with no formal feedback process. So why are we asking people here about it? Because obviously, if we continue a status quo, that predominantly involves cellular pathologists. But if we split this into lymphoid and bone marrow, is that going to expand to a wider population who wish to participate in the bone marrow component? And should that bone marrow component be pure histopathology with a bit of integrated relevant information, or should that be a fully integrated HMDS style EQA, similar to what we heard about earlier? In terms of feedback and poor performers, do we need to register with the college? How do we feed back to those who are not necessarily performing? Does this stay as something educational, or does it stay as is it a measure of performance? And what sort of cases should be included? This is always a matter for debate. Should this be complete, routine, run-of-the-mill work? Should it be educational cases? Should it be rare cases? Should it be a mixture of both? And I will leave it there to open to any questions on both components or any comments on this.
So, right at the back there, just Debbie.
Yeah, thanks. My question to Lakshmi, when you gave your data about 30% of histopathologists are not working within an HMDS, but all of them want to move towards integrated reporting, which is in an HMDS, and we obviously know that every hematopathologist is precious resource, like they all need to continue their work. How does the BLPG and this group think it can work together to move towards everyone being part of a HMDS?
I think the short answer is HMDS is an evolving concept. It's not one size fits all. Some of it is definitely geographical, and if you even consider how much our working patterns have changed since COVID, so much of it is now virtual. So it is possible that we can get some sort of HMDS-like standard, which is uniformly applied, only we might not call it a single integrated HMDS. We know there is no funding in NHS for co-localization. We know pathologists or a lot of people are now working remotely. In fact, it's only wet lab work that is being done on site, and a limited amount of, say, training, etc., happens on site. So in this current climate, the HMDS horse is unfortunately already bolted. So that's how I feel. All BLPG throughout its history has done is enforce well, not enforce, but get by consensus in agreement to follow good practice and high standards. And that's really all we can do.
Okay, I mean, I might feel slightly differently. I just wonder whether there is an opportunity that we can engage all the individual histopathology laboratories into the HMDS model via exactly what you say, which is that it's becoming more a specialty that can be with digital or with networking, with not necessarily needing everybody on site. I don't know. I mean, my views might be different, but I feel that as a HMDS, that is the model we should be aspiring to completely. But
we discussed a lot of this morning in terms of what integrated reporting is, and I think what we're hearing is there are diversity of views, diversity of practices, which there's no single right answer yet, but what we're almost doing today is mapping out the diversity, and then we're going to try and work together to seek consensus. Debbie, I can't remember if you were here this morning, but you may have missed some of the discussions. So let's move on. So I think we had a hand up at the back there, but we have a microphone here in the middle.
Yes. Sorry, so I was just going to say from Birmingham perspective, so in the West Midlands, we've got that network model that Debbie's talking about, and I think definitely digital pathology will improve that and transform that. So we've got a big hub in Birmingham providing fully centralised flow cytometry and genetics, but then we have a networked relationship with the pathology networks around us, and there's 3 of them that are providing for big populations, and they have haematopathology in those centres. And so we provide a sort of a tertiary review, but we certainly don't see every trophine for the West Midlands. And we're very keen to really build those formalised network HMDS relationships to support our haematopathologists, and we work very well with them.
And I think one of the findings for the workforce survey is this kind of networked versus some people spending most of the time in co-located HMDSs. There's certainly variation across the country. It's really interesting. And yeah, there's someone online who's not muted. Right, at the back.
Thank you. Just a comment on the EQA talk. I'm envious of your scheme. It looks really well set up. I'm a haematologist. I report trophines, but not lymph nodes. My observation, I think, would be that if you were to split your lymph node and your bone marrow trophine aspects, you would probably find that there was considerable interest from haematologists and clinical scientists who report trophines but not nodes. And hearing what NECWAS Ally are working towards in terms of an integrated HMDS EQA scheme earlier, it may be that sticking with something similar to what you've got, but splitting the lymph nodes from the trophines might help better cover the scope of practice between those various schemes in the UK.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, given our talks from NEQAS this morning. I know the EQA scheme you have, the EQA scheme that NEQAS are running and proposing running, isn't the same thing, has slightly different aims. Some of the aims are overlapping. I would like to see you working together with NEQAS to come up with a proposal for the rest of us as to how we take those different aspects forward. That's just a request from me. So we have Ulrika and then Tim, I think.
Yeah, just very briefly what Sam said, and also just to recognise, I mean, we are in crisis where I am for haempaths and have been for some time. We're sort of held up by people from afar, and everyone is absolutely amazing. But so I think one has to recognise that there is a goal to where everybody wants to be, but the road to get there is blocked by various managers and trusts and, you know, money and politics. So the important thing, I think, is communication, to make sure that, you know, if you work from afar or if it's split up and you're not inside a HMDS, that diagnostic culture and the communication is sort of happening. That was just my little thought.
Just very quickly, so I'm not going to put Stuart on the spot too much, but obviously I've seen that the NEQAS CPT scheme have a trophine system in one of their EQA schemes. I'm just wondering whether, obviously you've got the HMDS scheme with LI, is it worth talking to the CPT team to see if we can sort of do some sort of integration with having digital pathology with the trophines?
I think I'm finding increasingly there are 2 significant components to the lack of hematopathologists. I think it's probably down to the fact of a doubly centralized world we're living in. I think we talked a little bit about centralization into HMDSs and a de-skilling with the resulting lack of people coming through the ranks. And once histopathology or lymphoma pathology is reported within histopathology department within the SIHMDS, perhaps with pathologists sitting in the SIHMDS or within the histopathology department, I feel there's a little bit of lack of advocacy for the specialty as well as kind of lymphoma in general, because if you're the histopathologists are not sitting with you, you don't see them when you're advocating for SIHMDS. I feel oftentimes that result in advocating for the liquid side of things. On the flip side of it, I often feel like, particularly now with the genomics as well, is that pathology or cellular pathology is no longer advocating for lymphoma because clearly that's a hematological specialty. So I feel like a little bit falling through the cracks here. So I think definitely some support and advocacy for the value of hematopathologists or histopathologists would be very helpful here. And again, the second component of this is kind of lack of career progression, really, because where do we go? You know, if you end up working in an SIHMDS where you don't sit within the SIHMDS, you can't upskill. Or if you work in SIHMDS where you no longer report genomics, where do you upskill? So I think the career that was quite good looking when I was looking for my jobs, having all these components to it, is no longer in existence really, and not really attractive for hematopathologists or trainees coming through the histopathology scheme.
Well, a quick response and then we'll have coffee.
Not particularly on the latter bit, but on your first comment about potentially falling through the gaps. I think that's where it's really important that the organisation, so for example, BLPG doesn't just sit on its own and work on its own, and it maintains very, very close collaboration with BSH and with flow cytometry, with all of these organisations to work together, because the risk is if you're working on your own, that's when people fall through the gaps because you're not all getting one message across. I think hopefully now, hopefully most of you knew about the BLPG, but if you didn't, you do now, and hopefully we can continue to kind of maintain this close collaboration.
You have a commitment from me and from NICRAS to it with you.